You, whoever you are, we are more akin than different. And the interesting thing, if you know some French, is always this dance around the pronouns. So here the pronoun is toi, qui que tu sois, and really, grammatically speaking, it should have been vous. So by doing that, the author automatically brings less distance between two people. So that's the idea of bringing people together. These verses, as John mentioned, come from a poet. Her name is Andrée Chédid. I don't know if some of you know her. She was born in the 20s in Cairo, where she lived most of her childhood. She was born in a Maronite Lebanese family, so a Christian family. And she grew up in Arabic, in French, and in English. In her mid-20s, she got married, went to live in Lebanon for a few years, and then moved to France, where she lived for the rest of her life. Chédid was not only fluent in many languages, by the way, she died in 2011, so she was not only fluent in many languages, she was also well versed in the experience of marginality because of her background. So maybe it's not surprising that her work is characterized by a constant desire to, and that's a quote, open our eyes to the suffering, misfortune, and cruelty of the world, but also to the light, to the beauty, to everything which helps us succeed, live better, and invest in the future. And that's what I've really liked about her work, this constant dance between the harsh reality of the world and a desire to bring some light and find ways to make it work better. A couple of years before her death, those lines were brought into a song. And this year, in the spring, her grandson, whose name is Mathieu Chédid, integrated that song into a new album. This is the cover from the album. And he mentioned, while talking about this album, that he wanted to put forward the theme that was so dear to his grandmother, bringing all of us together, blurring the boundaries between us, helping us see ourselves in others and others in ourselves, and building bridges to reduce violence, hatred, and isolation. And it's really to this issue of building bridges that I want to speak today. I remember that I think it was in 2011, the Community Foundation of Vancouver decided to do a survey and to interview Vancouverites to find out what the main issue, the main concern was in the city. They expected that people would say poverty, homelessness, climate change, economic instability. It turned out that people mentioned social isolation. That really surprised them. Well, they had interviewed, I think, 4,000 individuals. 1/3 of those between the ages of 25 and 34 felt alone more than they would like. Another 1/3 said that they had trouble making friends. 40% of high-rise dwellers felt lonely. 40%, that's almost half. In addition, at the same time, they could see that there was a growing number of studies pointing out that the loneliest people report being in the poorest health. Loneliness is bad for our health. Being lonely puts us at a greater risk of experiencing depression, anxiety. It increases our vulnerability to a wide range of health problems, and it can even lead to premature death. I witness this social isolation and loneliness in much of my work. I see, for instance, that people come to food programming not simply to access good food, but because they want to experience human warmth, human connection. And I'm acutely aware of the fact that within low-income communities, people are experiencing a really hunger for belonging. And that's the reason why I've been delighted to see that the Community Foundations of Canada have invested a great deal of time and energy for the past 3 or 4 years, I think, on unpacking the concept of belonging as a venue to reduce the rate of loneliness and boost our community vibrancy. But before I talk more about belonging, I thought it would be important to spend some time on trying to define what it is. I've done some workshops with diverse groups on the issue of belonging. I have interviewed people, and then I've also carried a lot of informal conversations about belonging. And when talking to people, it becomes clear that the most common definition of belonging, or what people expect out of belonging, is really 3 things. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be valued. As simple as that. But while it may seem simple, it can be much more difficult. And through this process, what happens is that the I becomes part of a stronger we. So what is important here is to remember that this process requires of us that we be open and willing to become vulnerable and to expose our full selves to others. For instance, a lot of people, when talking about belonging, talk about fitting in. Now, fitting in and belonging are not the same thing. Fitting in means chopping parts of our identity that we feel may just not fit so well. And so we end up hiding parts of ourselves to feel that we will be more welcome. That means that we are never fully present in the process. So to belong is that ability to bring our full self to the conversation and to the table. So that's what's happening at the individual level. But because it means taking a risk, becoming vulnerable, there is also the community correlation in that equation. And as I pointed here, there has to be a process in place at the community level to foster this belonging, to make sure that people are welcome, to address some of the systemic barriers that hinder people's participation into the community. So this picture was taken at the Tallwood Community Garden. This is the 45th community garden in our region. It's a garden with a unique story. The garden brought together a lot of newcomers to the community, and what we've heard through the course of the season is how much the garden has become a site for socializing. Lots of picnics have been happening at the site, and people have enjoyed not only the fruit of their labor in terms of the produce that they've grown, but they particularly enjoyed getting to connect with one another, check in with one another on a regular basis. I see this kind of work happening all the time in the area of food. Now, as I mentioned, Community Foundations of Community Foundations of Canada have been doing work on trying to understand better what's behind this whole concept of belonging. So in 2016, they published a report, and in that report, they were looking at the many ways that strengthen participation and enhance belonging. And they identified key pathways. And as you can see on the slide, there's faith, there's sports, there's activism, there's online presence, and the arts. Some of those factors might be easy to understand. For instance, the arts, there's incredible amount of work done on highlighting how the arts, participating in a book club, joining a theater group, all sorts of arts-related activities can enhance belonging. Is there any kind of factor that you find more surprising in that list? Online, yes, it's interesting, because a lot of people think online is actually disconnecting us from each other. But what was interesting is that their research pointed out that people who are online are also much more likely to visit their neighbors and to help out. So that, yes, that may be surprising to people. Otherwise, you can see those ideas being pretty, you would think of them as being connected to belonging. Maybe the issue of activism might be a bit surprising to some people, because we tend to think of activism as, going and protesting or going on strike. But activism in that case is really about getting together with others to work for change. And so they find that people who participate in a group, a monthly group or a meeting, have at least 10 people in their lives, 10 friends or acquaintances. That's an important concept because we know from work done around the Community Wellbeing Index that in order to be less vulnerable to chronic illnesses and to be less vulnerable to loneliness, we need at least 6 people in our lives. And not any 6 people, because they tend to discount family members for all sorts of the reasons, that may not be people who are as close to us, though in some cases they are. So we need 6 people to be in a better position to belong, and in that case, activism tells us that people who are active have at least 10 people, so that's a good buffer. Now, I have to tell you that when I saw this list, I was particularly disappointed, because of course, I was expecting food to be on the list. I know it goes into the arts piece, but I think, I want to make an argument that food should be up there, because it's a great entry point, and I do see through other work that I do how much it fosters belonging. I see Rosanna nodding. I hope that you agree with me as well. So on Monday, a new report was issued, and this one focused more on the factors that influence belonging. Again, here you can see those 6 key factors: where we live, public spaces, economic inclusion, safety and security, migration and citizenship, and families. Now, I wanted to see how many people were new to Peterborough or were born and raised here, because you can imagine that when you stay in the same place your whole life, your sense of belonging would be quite different than when you have to start all over again. But I was noticing from your hands that more than half of the people in this room were not born here, which is interesting. Public spaces. I think that we have constant debates in this community about how public spaces can enhance or deter our sense of belonging. Places like libraries. I was reading that 41% of Canadians are active library card holders. So libraries are create a strong sense of community, even in a time where digital work is growing. But we also parks, having spaces where we can go and get together, meet strangers and play with one another is really critical in building belonging. But the piece here, the next one, is economic inclusion. In the work I do, that's where I see a great deal of disparity. We live in a society where we tend to be defined by our work. People meet and say, "What do you do?" So there's that idea. And work becomes our main source of income. So, of course, it's going to have a huge impact on our capacity to participate and to be part of vibrant groups. A lot of people, for instance, see their workplace as a huge contributor to their sense of belonging. And we are seeing now more and more challenges in terms of that economic inclusion. I wanted to point out in particular the Broadband Institute several years ago did a wealth gap analysis. And I thought it was interesting to see that not only are we seeing the gap between the rich and the poor increasing, but what was particularly interesting to me was the conception we have of that gap. So for instance, when asked how much wealth the poorest 20% of Canadians own, people in Canada responded 5.8%, when in reality they own 0%. And when asked how much wealth the richest 20% of the population own, Canadians thought it was 55.5%. In reality, it's 67.4%. So we are disconnected with what is actually happening on the ground. And this increasing gap is threatening our ability to build strong and vibrant communities. Migration and citizenship obviously also impacts our sense of belonging. Immigrants and newcomers face systemic barriers to full participation in the communities. Discrimination, racism, finding access to meaningful work with a living wage can be a challenge. In the food sector, we rely heavily on temporary foreign workers to harvest most of the produce that we eat. Yet only 2% of people who arrive through the seasonal agricultural workers program become permanent within 5 years of coming to Canada. 2%, that is ridiculously low. Safety and security. Yesterday, as you know, we were marking commemorating the number of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. We have different relationship to safety and security in this country. Overall, Canadians feel that they're pretty safe, 93%, but when you pull Indigenous community members, when you pull racialized communities, that number drops significantly. I think there's a rhythm to belonging. All the activities that I talked about, they require time. They require a serious investment of time. And in a community that is becoming, or in a country that is becoming more increasingly time-starved, that becomes potentially a challenge. Book clubs, food classes, community gardens, all those activities enable us to belong if we spend more time with others. I was mentioning at the table that we see that with community gardens. The first year people join because they want to grow their food, but then they stay because of friends they make. But that's a significant investment of time. I also found that with dog walkers. Are there some dog walkers in the room? Yeah, just a few? Okay. So, being able to walk around your neighborhood at a regular time gives you the opportunity to meet others. And then depending on the kind of dog you have, you're going to meet more or less people. I've had several dogs. This one is the most recent one, and her name is Maddie. And she is a community builder in disguise. I can't tell you the number of people who come and say, "What kind of dog is she?" Or, "Can I pet your dog? Can I hug her?" When I walk on my own, I don't get that kind of curiosity or interest. I feel cheated. And so, yes, again, this idea of spending the time going around on a regular schedule can lead you to meet others more regularly. I think that there's also a grammar of belonging. My involvement in community building work has given me a full respect and love for the prefixes, those pieces before a word, and the prefixes con, come, and co. They seem insignificant, and yet they can make such a difference. And I'll give you an example. Think about housing and think about co-housing. Co-housing is also called cooperative housing, community housing. The addition of those two letters can completely transform our understanding and vision of housing. Co-housing was a concept, I think, that grew out of Denmark in the 60s. It essentially combines private and common spaces. It can be one simple residential building where, in addition to individual units, residents have access to a communal kitchen, a dining space, laundry facilities, even also a recreational space. Some models of co-housing integrate several buildings, while others actually spread over a whole neighborhood. Regardless of what the model is endorsed, co-housing is impactful on many levels. It can address social challenges by establishing essentially a small community on many levels. It can address also ecological concerns. Many co-housing are really have a strong green ethos and try to reduce the carbon footprint of the building. And it can also address economic challenge around housing because it can be cheaper to bring people together for housing. Now, I won't say too much about housing. I know there are a lot of people who've been specialized in housing in this room. But I think that what I wanted to bring to your attention is that when we think about co-working on things can be transformed. Working together and building micro-communities, however, is not easy. And here is the commitment component of the belonging that I mentioned earlier. It's extremely important. The closer people work together, the greater the rewards potentially, but also the greater the possibility of challenges can rise up. That's why it's important to learn the grammar of belonging and become familiar with its structure. I often say that the gardening component of a community garden is the easy part. Seeds, they just want to grow. Community, not always. It is the most rewarding part of the process, but sometimes it takes a lot of work. And I know many people here in the room have been involved in that kind of work, so I'm not telling you anything new. Now, I read several years ago that we need to know at least 100 stories to reach our best mental health. 100 stories, 100 different stories. They help us develop a fuller perception of the world around us in ways different individuals relate to it. We discover stories that are much different from our own and learn new ways of framing and solving problems. If we reduce our exposure to different perspectives, if we only hear the same stories again and again, we significantly undermine our capacity to reach our best mental health and our community's capacity to become fully vibrant. This leads me to another word that starts with a prefix I appreciate so much: conversations. I was delighted to learn that the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough was planning to launch these 100 vital conversations. Conversations, when well done, are absolutely essential building blocks in our collective capacity to ensure that everyone's voice is being heard and respected. Key ingredients in building belonging, as I mentioned earlier. I feel that we are currently at a crossroad. I believe that there are 3 issues at the core of all our work right now, issues that are absolutely essential to address if we want to really create a vibrant and sustainable community and a vibrant and sustainable country. Those issues are truth and reconciliation and establishing a new relationship between Indigenous and settlers communities, poverty, and climate change. I see the 3 issues as being intricately woven. In addition, many of the structures that have helped us to grow connections among each other are being eroded. Our faith groups, our families, our places of origins don't play the role they used to. This means that we have to rethink the ways we organize ourselves and grow our communities. We need our voices to come to the table, to listen to one another, and devise new and creative solutions that will build vibrant communities where we can bring our full selves. The Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough has devised a new tool, one which I look forward to exploring with you today. It seems like it's a playful and yet practical tool at the same time, one which I hope will be instrumental in not only engaging us in hosting conversations that matter more than ever, but also in helping us broaden our collective thinking and devise new solutions, which in the end, I hope, will help us grow a more welcoming community, which will be known for that capacity, maybe. I wanted to find a way to bring the county in that slide, but Belonging City was, or Electronic City was the only picture I had. I would love to find out for somebody in the county if you have an image that I could borrow for, later on to do something. So, an image that could be brought to this conversation. Anyways, thank you so much.